Blood, the metallic scent that would haunt my dreams forever, hit me the moment I stepped into my son's bedroom at 3:17 a.m. that October night. There, on her knees beside Edward's bed, was my daughter-in-law Laura, frantically scrubbing crimson stains from the white wall with trembling hands that seemed to belong to a ghost rather than the vibrant 33-year-old woman I thought I knew. My name is Patricia Coleman. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in this same house in Burlington, Vermont for 43 years. I raised 3 children within these walls, buried my husband here after his heart attack 5 years ago, and thought I'd seen every kind of family crisis imaginable. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I discovered that night. The strange noises had awakened me from a restless sleep. At first, I thought it might be raccoons in the attic again, or perhaps the old furnace acting up. But there was something different about these sounds. Desperate, urgent, almost human. After lying in bed for 20 minutes, my maternal instincts kicked in. Edward had been staying with me for the past month after losing his job at the engineering firm, and Laura had been visiting daily, supposedly to help him through his depression. When I called out Laura's name from the doorway, she froze like a deer caught in headlights. Her usually perfectly styled blonde hair was disheveled. Her designer clothes, the ones my son had spent his last $800 on for their anniversary dinner, were stained with what I now realized was blood. The cleaning supplies scattered around her told a story I wasn't ready to hear. "Laura, honey, what happened? Where's Edward?" My voice cracked as I stepped closer, my bare feet suddenly cold against the hardwood floor I'd lovingly installed when Edward turned 16. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Her lips moved soundlessly, and her green eyes, the ones Edward had fallen in love with 7 years ago, stared at me with a mixture of terror and something else I couldn't identify. Guilt, perhaps. Or was it relief? That's when I saw it. A single work boot protruding from beneath Edward's queen-sized bed. The same steel-toed boots I'd bought him last Christmas for $150, hoping they'd bring him luck in his job search. My heart hammered against my ribs as I dropped to my knees beside Laura, my arthritic joints screaming in protest. What I found under that bed would shatter every assumption I'd made about my family, about my son, and about the woman he'd married. Edward lay there, motionless, his face pale as winter snow, a deep gash across his forehead, still seeping blood onto the Persian rug I'd inherited from my mother. But he was breathing. Barely, but breathing. "Laura," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my own heartbeat. "What have you done?" For the first time since I'd entered the room, she looked directly at me, and in that moment, I saw something in her expression that chilled me to the bone. Not remorse, not panic, but cold, calculated determination. "Patricia," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "you need to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Your son, your precious Edward, he's not the man you think he is." As I knelt there in that blood-stained room, holding my unconscious son's hand, I realized this wasn't just about a family crisis or marital problems. This was about secrets that had been festering in my house for months, maybe years. Secrets that involved the $50,000 I'd lent Edward for his business investment, the mysterious phone calls he'd been receiving at all hours, and the strange men who'd been asking questions about him around town. The nightmare was just beginning. If this story has gripped you like it gripped me that night, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real-life family drama. And don't forget to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one and love connecting with viewers around the world who understand that sometimes the most shocking stories happen right in our own homes. The silence in Edward's room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap as Laura's words echoed in my mind. "He's not the man you think he is." What could she possibly mean? This was my Edward, the boy who used to build elaborate Lego cities and cry when he accidentally stepped on an ant. The young man who'd held my hand through every one of my husband's chemotherapy sessions. "Laura, stop talking nonsense and help me get Edward to the hospital," I said, reaching for my phone with shaking fingers. But before I could dial 911, Laura's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "No hospitals, Patricia. Not yet. Not until you understand what's been happening under your own roof." Something in her tone made me pause. Despite her disheveled appearance and the blood on her clothes, there was a clarity in her voice that I hadn't heard in months. She'd been different lately, quieter, more watchful, jumping at sudden noises. I'd attributed it to stress from Edward's unemployment and their financial struggles. Laura released my wrist and sat back on her heels, her breathing finally beginning to steady. 3 months ago, I discovered that Edward had been stealing money from your accounts. Not just the $50,000 you gave him willingly, Patricia. He's been forging your signature on checks, using your credit cards, even took out a second mortgage on this house. The words hit me like physical blows. That's impossible. Edward wouldn't. $127,000, Patricia. That's how much he's stolen from you over the past year. I have all the documentation hidden in our apartment. Bank statements, forged checks, credit card receipts for gambling debts you never knew existed. I stared down at my son's pale face, searching for signs of the stranger Laura was describing. Even if that were true, it doesn't explain this. I gestured at the blood staining the wall. It doesn't explain why he's unconscious and bleeding. Laura's composure cracked slightly, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. Because when I confronted him tonight with the evidence, when I told him I was going to expose everything to you and the police, he attacked me, Patricia. He grabbed that ceramic lamp from your nightstand, the one with the blue flowers that belonged to your mother, and he swung it at my head. I looked around the room for the first time since entering. Really looked. The antique lamp I'd treasured for decades lay shattered near the dresser, its base stained with blood. The realization hit me slowly, like pieces of a nightmare puzzle falling into place. You defended yourself, I whispered. I had no choice. He was screaming things I'd never heard him say before, calling me names that would make your skin crawl. He said he'd kill me before he'd let me ruin his plans. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money, Patricia. This was about something much darker. Laura reached into her back pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. I found this in his car last week. It's a note from someone named Marcus Volkov. Ring any bells? The name made my blood run cold. Marcus Volkov was a loan shark who'd been making headlines in Burlington for his violent collection methods. 3 businesses had been firebombed this year alone when owners couldn't pay their debts to him. Edward owes Marcus $200,000, Laura continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Money he borrowed against this house, against your retirement funds, against everything you've worked for your entire life. And Marcus is coming to collect tomorrow night. The room began spinning around me as the full scope of my son's betrayal became clear. The mysterious phone calls, the strange men asking questions, Edward's sudden interest in updating my will and life insurance policies. It all made horrible sense now. There's more, Laura said, and I wondered how there could possibly be more. Edward's been meeting with Marcus's associate, planning to have you declared incompetent so he could gain power of attorney. He's been putting small amounts of your anxiety medication in your evening tea for weeks, documenting your confusion and memory problems to build a case. The dizzy spells, the foggy thinking, the times I couldn't remember conversations. It hadn't been age or grief affecting my mind. It had been my own son, methodically poisoning me to steal my independence and my life savings. As I knelt there in the blood-stained room, looking at Edward's unconscious form, I realized I was staring at a stranger. The son I'd raised and loved had been replaced by a calculating predator who saw his own mother as nothing more than a target to exploit. Laura wiped the blood from her hands with a towel, her movements now purposeful and determined. Patricia, we have less than 18 hours before Marcus comes looking for his money. And when he realizes Edward can't pay, this house, your house, becomes collateral. We need to decide right now whether we're going to let Edward's choices destroy everything you've built, or if we're going to fight back. Looking into Laura's eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Courage. This woman had risked everything to protect not just herself, but me. While my own son had been systematically destroying my life, his wife had been gathering evidence and trying to find a way to save me from financial and emotional ruin. The question now was simple but terrifying. How far was I willing to go to reclaim my life from the son who'd betrayed me? Edward's eyelids fluttered open at 4:23 a.m., and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But that illusion shattered the instant he focused on Laura and me kneeling beside him, his expression shifting from confusion to cold calculation in seconds. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "Laura's been telling you lies, hasn't she? You can't trust anything she says. She's been having an affair, stealing from us both. I was trying to protect you when she attacked me. Even after everything Laura had revealed, hearing my son speak with such practiced deception made my stomach lurch. This wasn't the confused rambling of someone with a head injury. This was manipulation, pure and calculated. Laura remained silent, but I watched her hand slowly reach for her phone on the nightstand. With deliberate movements, she activated the voice recorder and placed it where Edward couldn't see it. "Edward," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Laura told me about the money you've been taking from my accounts. She showed me documentation. How do you explain that?" For just a moment, barely a heartbeat, I saw panic flicker across his features. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he smiled that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble countless times as a child. "Mom, think about what you're saying. Why would I steal from you when I know everything will be mine someday anyway? Laura's been forging documents, probably planning to frame me so she can take control of your finances herself. She's been poisoning you against me for months." The audacity was breathtaking. Even knowing what I now knew, part of me wanted to believe him. This was the power of a lifetime of manipulation, of love twisted into a weapon of control. "Then explain this," Laura said quietly, pulling out her phone and showing Edward a photograph. "Explain why you've been meeting with Marcus Volkov at the Riverside Diner every Tuesday for the past 2 months. Edward's face went white, but his voice remained steady. "I don't know who that is." "Really?" Laura swiped to another photo. "Because here you are, shaking hands with him outside First National Bank. And here's another one of you giving him papers that look suspiciously like the property deed to this house." I watched my son's jaw clench as his carefully constructed lies began crumbling around him. "You've been following me? Stalking me like some deranged? Like someone trying to protect her family," Laura interrupted. "Like someone who noticed her husband sneaking out at night and wanted to understand why their joint checking account kept mysteriously losing money." Edward struggled to sit up, wincing as he touched the gash on his forehead. When he looked at me this time, there was no trace of the son I remembered. Only cold fury. "You know what your problem is, Mom? You're weak. Dad always said so. You're too trusting, too naive to survive in the real world. That's why you need me to manage your affairs, to make the hard decisions you're too emotional to make." The cruelty in his voice was like a slap across the face. "Your father never said anything like that. He loved and respected me until the day he died." Edward laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Dad died knowing you'd lose everything without him to protect you. That's why he made me promise to watch over you, to make sure you didn't make foolish financial decisions. Everything I've done has been to honor that promise. By stealing $127,000, by trying to have me declared incompetent, by drugging my tea, each accusation came out stronger than the last as fury finally overtook my shock and grief. I was protecting your assets from your own poor judgment," Edward replied without missing a beat. "And as for the medication, you've been showing signs of dementia for months. I was documenting it for your own good, so we could get you proper medical care." Laura stood up slowly, her phone still recording. "Tell her about Marcus Volkov's ultimatum, Edward. Tell her what happens tomorrow night if you don't pay him $200,000. Edward's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the desperate, cornered animal underneath. "You have no idea what you've done, you stupid bitch. Marcus doesn't make empty threats. If I can't pay him by tomorrow night, he'll burn this house down with all of us inside." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. My son, my own son, had put my life in danger to feed his gambling addiction and whatever other vices had consumed the man I thought I'd raised. "How much did you really lose, Edward?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. He looked at me with something that might have been regret, but was more likely self-pity. $340,000 over the past 18 months. Poker games, sports betting, some bad investments. It started small, just borrowing a few hundred here and there from your account to cover losses, planning to pay it back when I hit a winning streak. But the winning streak never came, Laura said softly. "No," Edward admitted, "and Marcus offered to stake me in a high-stakes game last month, said I could win back everything I owed and more. But I lost everything, including money that didn't belong to me." I felt something inside me break, not my heart, which had been shattered already, but my illusions. This was my son, reduced to a pathetic gambling addict who would steal from his own mother and put her life at risk to chase his addiction. "So you plan to have me declared incompetent and use my money to pay your debts," I said. "And when that wasn't enough, what then?" My life insurance? Edward's silence was answer enough. Laura reached over and squeezed my hand, her touch grounding me in the moment. "We have a choice to make, Patricia," she said. "We can call the police right now, let them handle Edward and Marcus Volkov, but that means this house, your retirement, everything you've worked for, gets tied up in legal proceedings that could take years." "Or?" I asked. Laura looked directly at Edward, her expression hard as stone. "Or we handle this ourselves. We take control of the situation and make sure Marcus Volkov gets exactly what he deserves. But it means trusting me completely, and it means accepting that Edward has made choices that have consequences." Looking at my son, really looking at him, I saw not the child I'd raised, but the enemy he'd chosen to become. And for the first time in my 68 years, I understood that sometimes survival requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about love and family. "Tell me what we need to do," I said. Dawn was breaking over Burlington as Laura and I sat in my kitchen, Edward locked in his bedroom with a chair wedged against the door from the outside. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now holding my own son prisoner in the house where he'd learned to walk and say his first words. Laura spread photocopied bank statements across my dining table like evidence in a courtroom. Each page told the story of my financial destruction, meticulously documented over months of investigation. Check forgeries dating back 13 months, credit card charges for online gambling sites I'd never heard of, cash withdrawals from ATMs across 3 states, always in amounts just under the reporting threshold. "The total damage is actually worse than I initially calculated," Laura said, pointing to a highlighted section. "It's $184,000 in direct theft, plus the $200,000 he owes Marcus Volkov. But there's something else." She pulled out a manila folder I hadn't seen before. "Edward took out a reverse mortgage on this house 6 weeks ago. He forged your signature and used fake medical documents claiming you have Alzheimer's disease. The loan amount was $150,000, and it's due in full if Marcus Volkov calls it in." The room spun around me as the numbers added up. Over $500,000. My entire life's work. The inheritance I'd planned to leave my grandchildren. The security my husband had died believing he'd provided for me. All of it gone to feed Edward's addiction and pay his debts to a violent criminal. "How is any of this legal?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's not," Laura replied. "But proving fraud takes time we don't have. Marcus Volkov doesn't care about legal proceedings or proper documentation. He cares about getting paid, and if Edward can't pay him by tonight, this house becomes collateral one way or another." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden my husband and I had planted together 30 years ago. The autumn roses were still blooming, defiant against the October frost, just like I needed to be defiant against the forces trying to destroy everything I'd built. "You said we could handle this ourselves," I said, turning back to Laura. "What exactly does that mean?" Laura's expression was grave but determined. "It means we use Edward's desperation against him. And it means we give Marcus Volkov exactly what he's asking for, but not in the way he expects." She pulled out her laptop and opened a series of files I recognized, my financial accounts, all of which she'd somehow gained access to. "You have $89,000 in your checking and savings accounts that Edward hasn't found yet. Plus, there's the $47,000 in your retirement account and about $23,000 in bonds and CDs. It's not enough to pay off Marcus completely, but it's enough to make him an offer." "What kind of offer?" Laura's smile was cold and calculating. "The kind that gets Edward exactly what he deserves. See, I've been researching Marcus Volkov for weeks, trying to understand what kind of man we're dealing with. He's not just a loan shark, Patricia. He's a businessman who values loyalty and hates being deceived above all else." She turned the laptop screen toward me, showing a news article about Marcus's most recent arrest. The charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the details painted a picture of a man who dealt harshly with people who tried to cheat him. "Edward has been lying to Marcus about his ability to repay the debt. He's been claiming that he's your power of attorney and that you've agreed to cover his gambling losses. Marcus thinks you're a willing participant in this arrangement. The implications hit me immediately. But I'm not. Exactly. And when Marcus discovers that Edward has been forging your signature and stealing from you without your knowledge, when he realizes that Edward has been using his mother as unwilling collateral, he's going to be very, very angry." Laura pulled up another document on her laptop, a detailed financial statement she'd prepared. documenting every theft, every forged signature, every lie Edward had told. We're going to give Marcus a choice. He can continue to demand payment from a gambling addict who's already stolen everything he can from his victim, or he can cut his losses and accept a partial payment in exchange for eliminating the source of his problem. You mean Edward? I mean, Edward faces the natural consequences of lying to dangerous people about money. We're not asking Marcus to hurt him, Patricia. We're simply going to stop protecting Edward from the choices he's made. I walked back to the table and studied the evidence Laura had assembled. It was comprehensive, damning, and absolutely accurate. My son had committed elder abuse on a massive scale, and now he expected me to bail him out of the consequences. There's one more thing, Laura said softly. The life insurance policies Edward updated last month, he made himself the sole beneficiary and increased the coverage to $500,000. He's been planning this for a long time, Patricia. If Marcus Volkov doesn't get him, Edward was prepared to arrange an accident to cover his debts. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place, and with it, any remaining sympathy I might have felt for my son evaporated. This wasn't desperation or addiction. This was premeditated murder for financial gain. How do we contact Marcus? I asked. Laura smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine warmth in her expression. I already have. He's agreed to meet with us at 2 p.m. today at his office downtown, but he thinks Edward will be with us to negotiate payment terms. And Edward? Edward is going to get exactly what he's earned, justice served by the very criminals he chose to get involved with. Sometimes, Patricia, the best thing you can do for someone you love is let them face the consequences of their actions. As I sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my son's betrayal and planning his downfall, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't a victim. I was taking control of my life and my future. Edward had made his choice when he decided to steal from me and threaten my life. Now it was time for him to live with the consequences. The sound of pounding from Edward's locked room echoed through the house, but I ignored it. He'd had months to confess, to seek help, to choose his family over his addiction. Instead, he'd chosen to see me as prey. Now he was about to discover that this old woman still had claws. At exactly 1:45 p.m., Laura and I walked into the Riverside Business Center, a nondescript office building where Marcus Volkov conducted his legitimate business operations. The autumn wind whipped through downtown Burlington, and I pulled my coat tighter, not just against the cold, but against the fear that had been gnawing at my stomach since we'd left Edward locked in his room. Marcus's office was on the 3rd floor, behind a door that simply read V&M Financial Consulting. The waiting room looked like any other business. Corporate furniture, motivational posters, even a coffee machine humming quietly in the corner. If not for the 2 large men in expensive suits flanking the receptionist's desk, you'd never guess this was the headquarters of Burlington's most feared loan operation. Mrs. Coleman, the receptionist, a surprisingly young woman with kind eyes, smiled at us. Mr. Volkov is ready to see you. Marcus Volkov was not what I'd expected. Tall and lean with prematurely gray hair, he looked more like a college professor than a criminal. His office was immaculate, decorated with family photos and what appeared to be legitimate business awards. But his eyes, cold, calculating, missing any trace of warmth, reminded me that appearances could be deadly deceptive. Mrs. Coleman, he said, standing to greet us with a firm handshake. Please, sit. I understand your son Edward is running a few minutes late? Laura and I exchanged glances. We'd practiced this moment, but sitting across from Marcus Volkov made everything feel terrifyingly real. Actually, Mr. Volkov, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, Edward won't be joining us today. We're here to discuss a different arrangement. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. I see. And what arrangement would that be? Laura opened her briefcase and pulled out the folder containing all the evidence we'd compiled. Mr. Volkov, what has Edward told you about his relationship with his mother's finances? Edward explained that he manages your accounts with your full consent, Marcus replied carefully, that you've agreed to cover his debts as part of a family investment strategy. Edward has been lying to you, I said bluntly. Everything he's told you about my consent and cooperation has been fabricated. He's stolen over $180,000 from my accounts through forged signatures and identity theft. I had no knowledge of his gambling debts until last night. Laura slid the documentation across Marcus's desk. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, forged checks, credit card fraud, and a fraudulent reverse mortgage on Mrs. Coleman's house. Edward has been committing elder abuse for over a year. Marcus studied the papers with the intensity of a man who'd built his fortune on reading people and situations accurately. When he looked up, his expression was no longer neutral. It was dangerous. You're telling me that Edward Coleman has been using his elderly mother as unwilling collateral for gambling debts he accumulated without her knowledge? That's exactly what we're telling you, Laura confirmed. And there's more. Edward has increased his mother's life insurance and made himself the sole beneficiary. He's been drugging her tea to document alleged mental incompetence. He was planning to have her declared unfit so he could access her remaining assets. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes now completely cold. And what do you propose I do with this information? We're prepared to offer you $75,000 as a good faith payment, I said. Not as Edward's debt, which isn't mine to pay, but as a settlement for the trouble his lies have caused your organization. In exchange, we want you to understand that any further collection efforts against me or my property are based on fraudulent information. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear my heart pounding in the silence. Finally, he spoke. Mrs. Coleman, in my line of work, I encounter many types of people: gamblers, addicts, desperate business owners, even other criminals. But there's one type I cannot tolerate: someone who lies to me about collateral they don't own. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the Winooski River. Your son told me that his mother, you, had personally guaranteed his debts. He showed me documents that I now understand were forged. He convinced me to extend credit based on assets that were never his to offer. What does that mean for Edward? Laura asked. Marcus turned back to face us, and his smile was colder than the October wind outside. It means Edward has committed fraud against both you and my organization. When someone steals from their own family and then uses that theft to deceive me into extending credit, it becomes personal. We're not asking you to hurt him, I said quickly. We just want him to face the consequences of his choices without destroying my life in the process. Mrs. Coleman, you misunderstand. I don't need to hurt your son. His gambling addiction and criminal behavior will destroy him far more effectively than any physical punishment I could devise. But I will make sure he understands that his lies have consequences. Marcus sat back down and pulled out his phone. I'm going to accept your offer of $75,000 as settlement for the fraud your son committed against my business. In exchange, I will remove any claims against your property and person. But Edward's debt? That becomes a different matter entirely. He dialed a number and spoke quietly into the phone. When he hung up, he looked directly at me. Mrs. Coleman, your son will be visited this evening by associates of mine who specialize in fraud recovery. They will explain to him that lying to creditors about collateral is a serious offense in our community. They will also inform him that his gambling privileges have been permanently revoked at every establishment from here to Montreal. And then? Then Edward will discover what happens when a compulsive gambler can no longer access credit and has burned all bridges with his family. Nature, as they say, takes its course. As we prepared to leave Marcus's office, I felt a mixture of relief and something darker, satisfaction. Edward had spent months treating me like a helpless victim, stealing my independence along with my money. Now he would learn that his elderly mother was far from defenseless. One final thing, Marcus said as we reached the door. If Edward attempts to contact you or enter your property after this evening, please let me know immediately. Men who commit elder abuse against their own mothers rarely stop at financial crimes. Walking out of that office building, Laura and I had accomplished something I'd thought impossible 12 hours earlier. We'd turned Edward's weapon against him, using his own lies and greed to free ourselves from his control. But as we drove home through the streets of Burlington, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of Edward's reckoning. We returned home at 4:30 p.m. to find Edward's bedroom door splintered and hanging open. My heart lurched as we rushed upstairs, but instead of finding him escaped, we discovered him sitting on his bed, phone in hand, desperately trying to reach someone who clearly wasn't answering. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "I've been calling Marcus for hours, but he won't take my calls. Mom, whatever Laura's told you, we can fix this." We just need to present a united front to Marcus and— Edward, I interrupted, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. Marcus isn't taking your calls because he now knows the truth about the money you stole from me. The color drained from Edward's face. What did you do? Laura stepped forward, her expression triumphant. We did what you should have done months ago. We told the truth. Marcus now knows that every guarantee you made using your mother's assets was based on forged documents and theft. Edward stood up so quickly he swayed, still clearly suffering from his head injury. You have no idea what you've done. Marcus doesn't just accept partial payments and walk away. When he finds out I can't cover the full amount, he already knows, I said. And we've reached an understanding. I'm paying $75,000 as settlement for the fraud you committed against his business. In return, he's removing all claims against me and my property. And my debt? Your debt remains your problem, exactly as it should be. Edward's face cycled through emotions: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally, rage. You're my mother. You're supposed to protect me, not throw me to the wolves. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, but instead of the guilt and self-doubt I'd felt for decades when Edward manipulated me, I felt only anger. I protected you for 37 years, I said, my voice rising. I protected you when you were arrested for drunk driving at 19, and I paid for your lawyer. I protected you when you lost 3 jobs in a row, and I supported you financially while you found yourself. I protected you when you married Laura and needed $15,000 for a down payment on your apartment. I protected you when your father died and you couldn't handle the responsibilities of being an adult man. Edward tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. And how did you repay all that protection? By stealing from me, by drugging me, by forging my signature and using my home as collateral for your gambling debts, by planning to have me declared incompetent so you could steal what little I had left, by taking out life insurance on me and planning God knows what kind of accident to cash in. Mom, I never would have. You increased my life insurance to $500,000 and made yourself the sole beneficiary, Edward. What exactly were you planning? The silence that followed was more damning than any confession. Edward looked between Laura and me, and I saw the moment he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies had finally collapsed completely. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said quietly. The gambling was supposed to be temporary, just until I could get back on my feet after losing my job. And when I started losing, Marcus said he could help me win it all back. I just needed collateral to get into the bigger games. So you used your mother, Laura said coldly, without her knowledge or consent. I was going to pay it all back. Once I hit the big win, I was going to replace everything I'd borrowed, and Mom would never have known. It was supposed to be temporary. 18 months, Edward. You've been stealing from me for 18 months. How temporary did you think it would be? Before Edward could answer, the doorbell rang. We all froze, understanding instinctively that this wasn't a casual visitor. Edward's face went white as he looked toward the window. They're here, he whispered. Through the bedroom window, I could see 2 men in dark suits standing on my front porch. They didn't look threatening. They could have been insurance salesmen or Jehovah's Witnesses. But something in their posture, their patience, the way they stood watching the house, marked them as Marcus's people. Mom, please, Edward begged, all his arrogance and manipulation replaced by genuine terror. Don't let them take me. I know I made mistakes, but I'm your son. I'm your only son. Looking at Edward's frightened face, I felt a moment of the old maternal instinct that had protected and enabled him for decades. This was my child, the baby I'd nursed and raised and loved despite everything. But then I remembered the words Marcus had spoken in his office. Men who commit elder abuse against their own mothers rarely stop at financial crimes. Edward hadn't just stolen my money. He'd stolen my agency, my dignity, my sense of safety in my own home. He'd turned my love for him into a weapon against me, and he'd been prepared to escalate to murder when theft was no longer sufficient. Laura, I said, my voice steady, would you please answer the door and let those gentlemen know that Edward will be right down? Mom, no! Edward lunged toward me, but Laura stepped between us. Edward, I said, looking my son in the eyes for what I knew would be the last time. You made choices that have consequences. You chose gambling over family. You chose theft over honesty. You chose to see your own mother as prey instead of family. Now you get to live with those choices. The doorbell rang again, and Edward's panic reached a crescendo. I'll disappear. I'll leave town tonight and never come back. Just don't let them take me. And go where, Edward? With what money? To do what? You've burned every bridge, destroyed every relationship, stolen everything you could steal. This is what rock bottom looks like. Laura was already heading downstairs to answer the door. As I heard her greeting Marcus's associates with professional courtesy, I turned back to Edward one final time. For 37 years, I loved you unconditionally. I supported you, protected you, enabled you, and forgave you. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse, Edward. It means caring enough about someone to let them face the consequences of their actions so they can learn to make better choices. And if they kill me, then you'll have died as the direct result of choices you made freely, without coercion, despite having every advantage and opportunity to choose differently. But I suspect Marcus is far too smart to create that kind of problem for himself. You're much more valuable to him alive and working to pay off your debt than dead and worthless. Edward's shoulders slumped in defeat as footsteps echoed on the stairs. When Marcus's associates appeared in the doorway, two polite, well-dressed men who could have been accountants, Edward stood up with surprising dignity. "Mrs. Coleman," one of them said, nodding respectfully to me, "we're here to escort Edward to a meeting with Mr. Volkov. We understand there are some discrepancies in the financial arrangements that need immediate clarification." "Take him," I said simply. As they led Edward away, he turned back once more. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything. I never meant for it to go this far." "I know," I replied, "but intentions don't erase actions, Edward. Goodbye." Watching my son walk out of my house between two of Marcus Volkov's men, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: freedom. The weight of protecting, enabling, and covering for Edward's destructive choices was finally lifted from my shoulders. He was no longer my responsibility. He was now Marcus's problem. 3 days passed in an eerie calm that felt more unsettling than the crisis we'd just survived. Laura had stayed in the guest room, both of us needing time to process what we'd been through and what we'd done. The house felt different without Edward's presence, lighter somehow, but also haunted by the magnitude of his betrayal. On Thursday morning, Laura found me sitting in the kitchen, staring at the pile of legal documents she'd organized on the dining table. Bank statements, insurance papers, property deeds, all the evidence of a life's work nearly destroyed by the person I'd trusted most. "Any word from Marcus?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Nothing direct," Laura replied, pouring herself coffee with hands that were finally steady. "But I drove past his office yesterday. Edward's car was in the parking lot. Alive then. Alive and apparently working. Marcus doesn't benefit from dead debtors, Patricia. He benefits from desperate ones who'll do anything to pay off what they owe." The phone rang, startling us both. These days, every unexpected sound made us jump, conditioned to expect crisis. But the caller ID showed a local number, my attorney's office. "Mrs. Coleman, this is Janet from Robert Sterling's office. Mr. Sterling needs to see you as soon as possible regarding some urgent financial matters. Could you come in this afternoon?" My stomach dropped. Robert had handled my legal affairs for 15 years, including my will, property transfers, and the power of attorney documents Edward had been so interested in updating. If he was calling urgently, it meant Edward's fraud had spread even further than we'd discovered. 2 hours later, Laura and I sat in Robert's mahogany-paneled office while he spread documents across his desk with the grim expression of a doctor delivering terminal diagnosis. "Patricia, I'm afraid the situation is worse than either of us suspected," Robert said, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by professional concern. "Edward didn't just steal from your accounts and forge documents. He's been impersonating you in legal proceedings for months. He handed me a stack of papers I'd never seen before. Court filings, medical evaluations, competency hearings, all conducted without my knowledge, all designed to have me declared mentally incompetent. According to these documents, you've been suffering from advanced dementia for over a year," Robert continued. "Edward provided medical testimony from 3 different doctors, all claiming you're unable to manage your own affairs. The competency hearing is scheduled for next Monday. But I've never seen any of these doctors," I protested. "I haven't had a medical evaluation since my annual physical 8 months ago." "I know. That's why I started investigating when Edward contacted me last week, asking about accelerated probate procedures. Nothing added up, especially since you seemed perfectly lucid when we updated your will last spring." Laura leaned forward, her expression sharp. What happens if this competency hearing proceeds? If Edward can convince a judge that Patricia is mentally incompetent, he gains full power of attorney over her finances, property, and medical decisions. She would legally become his ward, with no rights to contest his decisions. The room spun around me as I understood the full scope of Edward's plan. This hadn't been about gambling debts or desperation. It had been a methodical campaign to steal not just my money, but my entire identity and autonomy. There's more, Robert said grimly. Edward has also filed preliminary paperwork to have you committed to a memory care facility. According to his documentation, you've become violent and dangerous to yourself and others. That's why he wanted documentation of my confusion, I realized. The drugging, the forged signatures, the meetings with fake doctors. He was building a legal case to have me locked away while he liquidated everything I own. Laura's face was white with fury. How is any of this possible without Patricia's knowledge? Unfortunately, our legal system makes it relatively easy for family members to initiate competency proceedings, especially when they can produce medical documentation, Robert explained. The courts assume family members are acting in their loved one's best interest. Can we stop the hearing? We can contest it, but that requires time we may not have. Edward has built a comprehensive case spanning 18 months. We'd need to prove that every medical evaluation was fabricated, every witness statement was false, and every piece of evidence was manufactured. I stood up and walked to Robert's window, looking out at downtown Burlington. Somewhere out there, Edward was working for Marcus Volkov, probably believing he'd dodged the worst consequences of his actions. He had no idea that I'd discovered the full extent of his betrayal, or that his carefully laid plans were about to collapse around him. What if Edward doesn't appear for the competency hearing? I asked. The proceeding would be postponed indefinitely, Robert replied. But Patricia, you can't just hope Edward disappears. If he surfaces later with this documentation, you could still face commitment proceedings. Laura stood up suddenly, her expression determined. What if we ensure Edward never surfaces? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Robert looked shocked, but I felt something darker stirring in my chest, not horror at Laura's suggestion, but cold calculation. Laura, I said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing we pay Marcus Volkov another visit, she replied. This time with evidence that Edward has been planning to commit elder abuse on a scale that goes far beyond theft. Medical fraud, false imprisonment, identity theft. These are federal crimes that would make Edward a liability to any criminal organization. Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ladies, I can't be party to any discussions about— You're not, I interrupted. You're simply our attorney, helping us understand the legal remedies available to victims of elder abuse. Laura and I will handle the rest. As we left Robert's office that afternoon, I realized we'd passed the point of no return. Edward's plan to destroy my autonomy and steal my identity was so comprehensive, so calculated, that half measures would no longer suffice. He'd forced us into a situation where only complete victory or total defeat was possible. Edward had spent months planning my legal murder, the systematic destruction of my identity and freedom. Now it was time to return the favor. But this time, I wouldn't be the victim. This time, I'd be the one making the hard choices about someone else's future. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson I was about to deliver would be final. Marcus Volkov looked genuinely surprised when Laura and I appeared at his office Friday afternoon without an appointment. But when we explained what we'd discovered about Edward's competency proceedings and identity theft, his surprise quickly transformed into the cold fury I was beginning to recognize as his signature expression. Let me understand this correctly, Marcus said, studying the legal documents Robert had provided. Edward Coleman has been conducting an 18-month campaign to have his mother declared mentally incompetent so he could gain control of her assets and have her committed to a facility? That's exactly what he's been doing, Laura confirmed. The gambling debts and theft were just the beginning. His ultimate plan was to have Patricia legally declared dead to the world while he liquidated everything she owns. Marcus stood up and walked to his office window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned around, his expression was darker than I'd ever seen it. Mrs. Coleman, in my line of work, I encounter criminals of every description: thieves, addicts, con artists, even killers. But what your son has done represents a level of calculated cruelty that I find personally offensive. Offensive enough to permanently solve our Edward problem? I asked directly. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mrs. Coleman, I think you misunderstand the nature of the solution I have in mind. Edward's death would be wasteful and unnecessary, but his complete social and legal destruction? That has a certain poetic justice. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Send Mr. Davidson in, please. The man who entered the office looked like a successful businessman. Expensive suit, confident bearing, the kind of person you'd trust with your investments. But his eyes held the same cold calculation I'd seen in Marcus's. Mr. Davidson specializes in identity reconstruction, Marcus explained. He helps people who need to completely disappear from their old lives and start over somewhere else. Usually, his clients are fleeing dangerous situations. But he's also quite skilled at making people disappear involuntarily. Mr. Davidson spread several manila folders across Marcus's desk. Edward Coleman's case is particularly interesting, he said in a cultured voice that reminded me of a college professor. His criminal activities over the past 18 months have created an extensive paper trail that can be used to destroy him legally without any violence whatsoever. He opened the first folder, revealing documents I recognized. Edward's forged checks, fake medical reports, and fraudulent legal filings. Elder abuse, medical fraud, identity theft, grand larceny, filing false legal documents. Edward has committed enough felonies to ensure he spends the next 20 to 30 years in federal prison. But that requires Patricia to press charges and testify against her son, Laura pointed out, which means months or years of legal proceedings and publicity. Exactly why I don't recommend that approach, Mr. Davidson replied smoothly. Instead, I propose we let Edward destroy himself using the very skills he's demonstrated so effectively against his mother. He opened a second folder, containing what appeared to be financial records and credit reports. Edward Coleman is addicted to gambling, correct? And he's proven himself willing to commit fraud to fund that addiction? Yes, I confirmed, wondering where this was leading. Then we're going to give him the opportunity to commit the largest fraud of his career against people who are far more dangerous than his elderly mother. Mr. Davidson pulled out photographs of several men I didn't recognize, but whose expensive clothing and cold expressions marked them as serious criminals. Edward's new assignment will be to infiltrate a high-stakes poker game run by Russian organized crime. He'll be given false identification, a fabricated background, and access to enough money to buy into games that typically require $500,000 minimums. And when he loses, Laura asked, he'll do what he always does, he'll steal. But this time, he'll be stealing from people who don't believe in legal remedies or court proceedings. When the Russians discover that Edward has been playing with stolen money and false credentials, they'll handle the situation according to their own traditions. Marcus leaned forward, his expression satisfied. Edward will disappear completely. Not dead, but erased. No identity, no documentation, no ability to resurface and threaten Patricia again. The Russians will put him to work paying off his debt in ways that ensure he can never return to his old life. What about the competency hearing? I asked. Edward's failure to appear will result in automatic dismissal of all proceedings, Mr. Davidson explained. Without the petitioner present to provide testimony, the court cannot proceed. And since Edward will no longer legally exist under his current identity, he can never refile the petitions. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its thoroughness. Edward would be destroyed using his own weapons, greed, deception, and addiction, turned against criminals who made Marcus Volkov look benevolent by comparison. How long before Edward's new assignment begins? I asked. Tonight, Marcus replied. He'll be told that his debt to my organization has been sold to a larger syndicate and that he has the opportunity to work off what he owes by participating in high-level games. His ego and addiction will make the proposition irresistible. Laura reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Patricia, are you sure about this? Once Edward enters that world, there's no bringing him back. I thought about the son I'd raised, the man who'd held my hand through his father's funeral, the boy who'd once cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant. But then I remembered the forged documents, the drugged tea, the calculated plan to have me committed while he stole my identity and my life. Edward made his choice when he decided to see his mother as prey instead of family, I said. Now he gets to live with the consequences of that choice in a world where everyone is prey and there are no protective parents to save him. Marcus nodded approvingly. Then we're in agreement. By Monday morning, Edward Coleman will have ceased to exist, and your legal and financial problems will be permanently resolved. As we prepared to leave Marcus's office, I realized that I felt no guilt, no maternal anguish, no second thoughts about condemning my son to a fate worse than death. Edward had spent 18 months systematically destroying my life, planning my legal murder, preparing to have me locked away while he stole everything I'd worked for. He'd taught me that sometimes survival requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about love, family, and forgiveness. Now he was about to receive a master class in the lessons he'd taught me. The only difference was that I'd learned them better than he had. Saturday evening came and went without any word from Marcus or his associates. Laura and I spent the day cleaning out Edward's room, packing his belongings into boxes that would never be claimed. Each item told the story of a life that had gradually descended from promise to pathology. High school trophies, college diplomas, wedding photos with Laura that seemed to mock the destruction he'd brought to their marriage. "Do you feel guilty?" Laura asked as we folded his clothes into donation bags. I considered the question seriously. "I feel sad," I replied. Sad for the boy he used to be, sad for the man he could have become. But guilty? No. Edward chose this path step by step, decision by decision. I'm simply allowing him to reach the natural destination of his choices. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was watering my late-season roses when a black sedan pulled into my driveway. My heart lurched, thinking it might be police or federal agents investigating Edward's disappearance. Instead, Mr. Davidson stepped out of the car, looking as composed as he had in Marcus's office. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, approaching with the same professional demeanor I remembered. "I wanted to update you personally on your son's situation. Is he—" I couldn't quite finish the question. "Edward is alive and exactly where he chose to be," Mr. Davidson replied. Friday night, he was offered the opportunity to participate in a poker game with a $750,000 buy-in, funded by what he believed was Marcus's organization. The game was genuine, the stakes were real, and the other players were exactly who we said they would be. Laura joined us on the front porch, her expression tense. What happened? Edward did exactly what his psychology predicted he would do. When he began losing heavily, he attempted to write fraudulent checks against accounts he didn't control. When those were rejected, he tried to use forged documents to establish credit. When the other players became suspicious, Edward claimed to be acting as power of attorney for his wealthy, incompetent mother. The irony was breathtaking. Edward had tried to use against dangerous criminals the exact same lies and deceptions he'd planned to use against me in court. "The Russians were not amused," Mr. Davidson continued. "When they investigated Edward's claims and discovered that his mother is perfectly competent and that he's been perpetrating elder abuse for over a year, they became quite angry. Apparently, they have strong cultural taboos against men who prey on elderly family members." "Where is he now?" I asked. "Edward Coleman no longer exists," Mr. Davidson said simply. "The man who was formerly your son is now known as Dmitry Volkov, a distant relative of Marcus who owes the Russian syndicate approximately $2.3 million and will be working to pay off that debt for the foreseeable future." "Working how?" "Various enterprises. Nothing that would be considered legal in the United States, but nothing that violates Russian cultural standards regarding the treatment of family debtors. He'll live, Mrs. Coleman, but he'll never again be in a position to harm you or anyone else." Laura sank into one of the porch chairs, her face pale. "He's essentially enslaved. He's experiencing the natural consequences of lying to dangerous people about collateral he doesn't own," Mr. Davidson corrected. "The Russians view Edward's debt as legitimate because he freely entered their poker game and attempted to defraud them using fabricated assets. From their perspective, they're simply collecting what they're owed." I walked to the porch railing and looked out at my garden, thinking about justice and consequences and the price of unconditional love. For 68 years, I'd believed that loving someone meant protecting them from the results of their actions. Edward had taken that love and weaponized it, using my protective instincts to enable increasingly destructive behavior until he'd planned my legal murder. "Will I ever see him again?" I asked. "The man you raised as Edward Coleman is gone, Mrs. Coleman. What remains is a criminal who made choices that led him to exactly where he deserves to be. Whether you consider that man worthy of your concern is entirely up to you. Mr. Davidson handed me an envelope sealed with red wax. Inside are the documents terminating all legal proceedings Edward initiated against you, signed by attorneys who specialize in making problems disappear permanently. Your competency hearing has been canceled, the fraudulent medical evaluations have been withdrawn, and all forged documents have been officially retracted. And financially, Marcus Volkov has arranged for the return of $89,000 to your accounts, money recovered from Edward's assets and the sale of certain items he won't be needing. It's not full restitution, but it's enough to restore your financial security. As Mr. Davidson prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. Mrs. Coleman, you should know that what you've done requires considerable courage. Many people in your situation would have continued enabling destructive behavior out of misplaced love. You chose to value your own life and dignity over protecting someone who saw you as prey. Was there any other choice? There's always another choice. You could have paid Edward's debts, covered his legal problems, allowed yourself to be declared incompetent, and spent your final years in institutional care while he liquidated your life's work. Many parents do exactly that, and enable him to destroy the next victim? Exactly. By refusing to be his victim, you prevented him from victimizing others. That takes wisdom that most people never develop. After Mr. Davidson left, Laura and I sat on the porch in comfortable silence, watching the autumn sun set over Burlington. The crisis that had consumed our lives for the past week was over, but the deeper questions remained. How do you love someone who sees love as weakness? How do you protect yourself from someone you're conditioned to protect? How do you distinguish between helping and enabling when the line keeps shifting? Do you think Edward will ever understand what he did to you? Laura asked. I think Edward will spend the rest of his life blaming everyone but himself for his situation, I replied. That's what addicts and abusers do. They externalize responsibility for their choices and convince themselves they're victims of circumstances beyond their control. And that doesn't bother you? It bothers me that I raised someone capable of such self-deception, but Edward's refusal to accept responsibility for his actions is what led him to this situation. If he could have acknowledged what he'd done and sought help, none of this would have been necessary. As darkness fell over my garden, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time since my husband's death, I was truly safe in my own home. My finances were secure, my legal status was protected, and the person who'd threatened everything I'd worked for could never harm me again. Edward was gone, but the son I'd mourned had been lost long before this week. What remained was just a predator who'd worn my child's face while planning my destruction. Now that predator was someone else's problem, exactly as it should be. 6 months later, I stood in my garden on a crisp April morning, planting the roses Laura had helped me select. The winter had been long and cold, but spring had arrived with unusual warmth, and my garden was responding with a kind of explosive growth that spoke of deep roots and strong foundations. The past months had been transformative in ways I never could have imagined. With the return of $89,000 and the elimination of Edward's fraudulent debts, my financial situation had stabilized enough for me to make some long-overdue improvements to the house. New windows, a renovated kitchen, and a security system that made me feel truly safe for the first time in years. But the most significant change wasn't financial. It was psychological. For the first time since my husband's death, I was living my own life instead of managing someone else's crisis. Laura had moved back to her own apartment in December, but she visited twice a week for dinner and had become the daughter I'd never had. Her divorce from Edward had been finalized easily. Since Edward Coleman no longer legally existed, she'd been granted dissolution of marriage due to abandonment. She'd kept his last name out of practicality, but she'd built a new life that had nothing to do with the man who'd tried to destroy us both. Any regrets? She asked as she helped me plant the new rose bushes along the front walk. About Edward? No, I replied honestly. I spent 37 years loving someone who saw that love as weakness to exploit. I won't apologize for finally refusing to be his victim. Have you heard anything? I shook my head. Through Marcus Volkov's organization, I'd received occasional updates confirming that the man formerly known as Edward Coleman was alive and working off his debt to the Russian syndicate. But those updates had stopped coming months ago, and I'd made no effort to seek additional information. He made his choice, I said, patting soil around the roots of a particularly beautiful red rose. And we made ours. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted our gardening. I looked up to see Robert Sterling's familiar Mercedes pulling up to the house. My attorney had become a good friend over the past months, helping me navigate the legal aftermath of Edward's fraud and the restoration of my financial independence. "Patricia," Robert called out cheerfully as he approached, "I have news that I think you'll want to hear." Laura and I brushed the soil from our hands as Robert spread several official-looking documents on my patio table. The federal investigation into Edward's identity theft and elder abuse case has been officially closed, he announced. All fraudulent documents have been purged from court records, all forged signatures have been documented and reversed, and your legal status has been fully restored. What does that mean, practically speaking? Laura asked. It means Patricia's identity has been completely cleaned and protected. No one can ever again use Edward's fabricated medical evaluations or competency claims against her. The federal government has essentially given her a clean slate and immunity from any future attempts to question her mental capacity based on Edward's fraud. I sat down at the patio table, overwhelmed by the finality of it all. So it's really over? It's really over, Robert confirmed. Edward Coleman's legal existence has been terminated. All his fraudulent activities have been documented and reversed, and you're completely protected from any residual consequences of his actions. Laura reached across the table and squeezed my hand. How does it feel to be completely free? I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have said that freedom meant being left alone to live quietly in my house, managing my garden and my memories. But Edward's betrayal had forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed and to make choices I'd never imagined I could make. It feels like starting over, I said finally. Like everything before, this was preparation for who I'm supposed to be now. That evening, after Robert left and Laura returned to her apartment, I sat on my front porch watching the sunset over Burlington. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. "Patricia?" The voice was unfamiliar, heavily accented, but not threatening. "This is Mikhail Volkov. I believe you know my cousin Marcus." My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. "What can I do for you, Mr. Volkov?" "I wanted you to know that the man who was once your son has completed his debt obligations to our organization. As of today, he is free to make his own choices about his future." "And what has he chosen?" "He has chosen to remain in our employ, Mrs. Coleman. Apparently, he has discovered that working for people who don't tolerate deception or theft has given his life structure it previously lacked. He asked me to tell you that he understands why you made the choices you made and that he hopes you can find peace in your new life." I was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected message. "Is he, well?" "He is alive, healthy, and useful," Mikhail replied, "which is more than he deserved after what he did to you. But second chances must be earned, and he appears to be earning his." After hanging up, I sat in my garden as darkness fell, thinking about forgiveness and justice and the complicated mathematics of love. Edward had received exactly what his choices had earned him. Not death, but consequences. Not revenge, but accountability. Not forgiveness, but the opportunity to build something better from the ruins of what he'd destroyed. Whether he took that opportunity was up to him. But it was no longer my responsibility to save him from himself or protect him from the consequences of his actions. For the first time in my adult life, I was responsible only for my own choices, my own future, my own happiness. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. As I finished telling you this story, I'm sitting in the same garden where it all began 9 months ago. The roses are in full bloom now, more beautiful than they've ever been. Sometimes the most gorgeous flowers grow from soil that's been disturbed by violence and loss. People ask me if I have any regrets about what happened to Edward. The answer is always the same. I regret that it took me 68 years to learn that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enablement. I regret that I allowed someone to use my maternal instincts as weapons against me. I regret that I confused protecting Edward from consequences with protecting him from harm. But I don't regret the choice I made that October night when I discovered the blood on the wall. I don't regret choosing my own survival over his comfort. and I don't regret allowing him to experience the natural consequences of stealing from his mother and lying to dangerous people about money. Edward taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to save them from themselves. Sometimes protecting someone requires letting them fall hard enough to learn not to make the same mistakes again. I'm 70 years old now, and I'm living my own life for the first time. Laura visits twice a week, and we're planning a trip to Europe next spring, something I always wanted to do but never felt free to attempt while managing Edward's endless crises. My finances are stable, my health is good, and my future belongs to me. The house that was once Edward's hunting ground is now my sanctuary. The garden that witnessed his betrayal now grows the most beautiful flowers I've ever seen. And the woman who was once his victim is now someone I barely recognize, stronger, wiser, and absolutely unwilling to tolerate abuse from anyone, regardless of their relationship to me. If this story has resonated with you, if you found yourself in a similar situation with someone you love who treats that love as weakness, remember this: you cannot save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You cannot love someone into making better choices. And you cannot protect yourself by enabling someone else's destructive behavior. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is step back and let someone you love face the consequences of their actions. It feels like abandonment, but it's actually love in its purest form, caring enough about someone to let them learn from their mistakes instead of protecting them from reality. Thank you for listening to my story. If it's helped even one person recognize that they deserve better than being victimized by someone they love, then sharing these painful memories has been worthwhile. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more real family stories that matter. Don't forget to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love hearing from viewers around the world who understand that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we're afraid to tell. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to hear them, and together we can build a community of survivors who refuse to let love become a weapon used against them. Remember, you are worthy of respect, safety, and love that doesn't come with conditions or cost. You deserve better than being someone's victim, even if that someone is family, and you have the strength to choose survival over sacrifice, even when it breaks your heart to make that choice. Stay strong, stay safe, and remember that your story matters too.